Welcome again. Thank you for joining us for our Borough Spotlight Queens panel. We are excited to get this panel started shortly. A reminder, attendees, you will see a chat box and a Q&A box, both directly to the right of your live stream video. Use them to communicate with other attendees and to send questions for consideration by our moderator. If you are having technical difficulties, check out our FAQs up top for how to get support, or click on the red icon in the lower right corner. With that out the way, let's get this session started. Thank you.
Thank you, Dakari, and welcome. Thank you all for joining today. My name is Jennifer Leisure. I'm the Deputy Director of Energy Sustainability Programs at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this afternoon's panel. I'm joined by our amazing panelists. We have Robert Friedenberg, Vice President for Energy and Environment at Regional Planning Association. We have Lori Miller, Executive Director at Neighborhood Housing Services of Jamaica. Dana Kagnauer at Vice President at Ogilvy, and Tyler Taba, Senior Manager for Climate Policy at Waterfront Alliance. During today's panel, we aim to put a spotlight on Queens, the range of issues that Queens residents face, and the lessons that we build on to support thriving neighborhoods. So let's get right to it. Rob, help us set the scene on climate risks. I know that you have a presentation to show us, a couple of slides. You said that in the aftermath of Ida, that we need to rethink the role of streets when thinking about the urban watershed in order to reduce risk in flood-prone neighborhoods. What can the city do for Queens to address this? And where would you start first?
Great. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks for having me and RPA on this panel. I'm glad to be here with all of my fellow panelists. So yeah, if we jump right into it, the first slide I have, it really shows us what the challenge is in terms of what Queens faces. So this is a map that we put together. It's actually part of a larger mapping effort we did where we wanted to show all the risks to New York City, climate risks, and neighborhood plans that were done. I'm not going to focus on the neighborhood plan aspect of it, but you should definitely check out this website, which we can include. I'll put it in the chat so you can see whether your community has had a resilience plan done. But what this map shows, and obviously this is beyond Queens, but because Queens is the largest borough in Manhattan, I find it's hard to put a slide on there that kind of doesn't show the other boroughs too. But Queens is suffering, I would say, a triple threat from climate change when it comes to flooding. You have the coastal flooding threat. We're in the 10-year anniversary of Sandy time period right now, and we all know how Queens communities took a hit during Sandy. And that's the threat from the coastal storms. These big storms happen. It doesn't have to be a Sandy. It can be a nor'easter. It could be kind of a tropical storm that creates storm surge. And you see a lot of Queens neighborhoods, both in and around Jamaica Bay, but also northern Queens, up off Long Island Sound and the Bay, where you see threats from coastal flooding. And this is the kind of thing we have to live with periodically. You also have the longer term threat of sea level rise. This is kind of, the coastal storm threat is the purple on the map. So all the places that are purple were really the coastal storm threat from storm surge. The darker blue that's kind of in that is the sea level rise. And I don't like to think of it this way, but I like to think of sea level rise as ultimately permanent flooding. So the places that we experience flooding in now from storms, that storm goes away, the waters recede, and you can get back to rebuilding and get back to life. Ultimately, our communities in Queens, a number of them will face the permanent flooding of sea level rise, where at a certain level of sea level rise, you're going to have high tide flooding that inundates communities every day or every high tide. And at some point, that water's not going to go away. And we have to grapple with that future now. Now we have a little time to grapple with that one. And with the coastal storm surge, we have the ability to kind of maybe build some temporary defenses and evacuate and rebuild. But the third threat is kind of this, you see pockmarked throughout this map, the light blue, is what we experienced during Ida. And that is the threat from extreme precipitation. So, the other two are flooding from the sea. This is flooding from the sky, where rain falls so hard in pools and in places that we have the kind of flooding we had during Ida, where we tragically lost, I think, 13 lives during Ida, the majority of those in basement units and the majority of those in Queens. And that's a real challenge. And that's something where it's not, you can't evacuate from that. And you can't say that's, 50 years down the line. These are the threats that we face today. So I'm going to dwell on that one a little bit more. And say that in central Queens, we did a study that found that 31,000 of the low density residential buildings in central Queens have below grade basements, the kind of places where people died during the storm. And that's a real threat. I think Queens is kind of ground zero in a way for this stormwater flooding, this flooding from the sky that extreme rain does. And that's something we really have to address and address soon. And I think that brings us to what I think is the opportunity that Jennifer responded to. So if you go to the next slide, we did a report a year and a half ago called Re-envisioning the Right of Way. So you may not recognize this, but this rendering that we put together is from Northern Boulevard in Queens, where Northern Boulevard hits Broadway. And it kind of gives you the sense of all the possibilities of what we could use our streets for. We have citywide 32,000 acres of space on our roads. That's a lot of real estate and a lot of opportunities to do things differently than we're doing now. So you can, we think of our streets today as mainly moving people and goods. It's mainly used for transportation. We have a nice green infrastructure program, but it's limited and it's small compared to the scale of the city. If you go back to that central Queens neighborhood where 31,000 below grade basements are, there's only 3 acres in all of that central Queens area that have green infrastructure. And you could deal with that flooding from those basements by expanding by 40 times how much green infrastructure you have. Now, that sounds like a lot, but if you go back to the streets, all you need are 5% of the streets to kind of be turned from transportation to green infrastructure uses to address the flooding in that neighborhood. It's just a small part of it. And I think this image kind of shows you what our streets could look like. You still have transportation and you still have green infrastructure. You can see a lot of the greenery that's added. There's, even if you look closely by that bus, there's a restored stream running alongside the street. There's a parking lot turned into a beautiful flood park where you can kind of capture water. And then there's also kind of social systems. So our report looked at kind of ensuring the transportation system is in place, having social systems like community gathering places, and natural systems where you make sure that the infrastructure is more natural and is kind of absorbing the floodwaters that will come. So I think, going back to the triple threat of Queens, it is a borough that has a lot of work to do, but there's also a lot of opportunity to address that. And I think you can start right in the streets of every community in Queens. Thank you.
Rob, thanks so much. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Tyler. Tyler, you've written that there's no silver bullet solution to climate resilience for the region's vulnerable areas. But if you had the power to streamline federal, state, and local policies, what would that look like for the neighborhood in Queens?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And thanks, Rob, for that great overview. This is a great question. It's a tough one, but I think one that everybody would like an answer to. And I promise I won't cop out of it, but I do want to explain sort of what I mean when I say there's no silver bullet. I think what I'm really trying to say is that there's not really any single solution to a lot of the climate risks that Rob outlined for us, right? I mean, we see that there's a whole host of climate challenges and impacts that we face. And it's clear that it's not just coming from one piece. It's not just rain, it's not just sea level rise, it's not storm surge and extreme heat. It's really all of this culmination of these things and how they interact together, and in some cases actually even amplify each other. For example, with sea level rise, we can expect to see greater storm surges or even greater sunny day and nuisance flooding in some parts of southern Queens. And so with that sea level rise. And so I think we shouldn't be really looking at these climate risks or solutions in silos or really on their own. We should really start looking at them and thinking about them comprehensively and holistically. And for those who may be not familiar with the term co-benefits when talking about climate solutions, I think it's one that was visible in the picture that Rob showed there from the opportunity slide. And it's one that I think we should all be familiar with, and to be frank, really demand from our city agencies and our elected officials. I'd like to give maybe just two examples of what co-benefits looks like. In that picture and in that slide that Rob was sharing, you noticed that on the street, you had some vegetation and some rain gardens. And so if we think about things like green roofs and rain gardens, what does that really mean from a climate standpoint? Well, one piece is that those sort of infrastructure solutions would help to absorb stormwater and rainwater that would otherwise be running off into the street and overwhelming our sewer network that clearly just doesn't have the capacity to handle future rain or really even current rain when we talk about storms like Ida and even some of these unnamed rainstorms that are really starting to see water just spewing out of the ground because there's no capacity in there. So that's one benefit of a green roof or a rain garden. But another benefit could also be reducing extreme heat and reducing the urban heat island effect, especially in a city with so much concrete. You might think that it's marginal to have a couple of green roofs and some street rain gardens, but imagine if there's sort of a network of these in place that have been identified for areas that experience really high levels of flooding or high levels of extreme heat. There's another thing that you could see from a green roof besides just pure aesthetic value is that you can start imagining reductions in your energy use and an increase in energy efficiency with the insulation, and so there's sort of multi-pronged ways of looking at some of these solutions. And another really good example that would maybe make more sense for Southern Queens could be some green infrastructure solutions along our coastline. There's also co-benefits here when you talk about, things like wetlands or living shorelines or oyster reefs. I think traditionally, maybe we see all of these solutions as just a way to enhance our ecology, right? They can provide habitat for birds and aquatic species, but these things also can provide opportunities for education and recreation. You see that very clearly, I think, in places like Jamaica Bay. But they're also really effective at attenuating wave impacts during storm events. And wetlands, if managed properly, unlike maybe a gray infrastructure solution like a bulkhead or a seawall, they can maintain their growth with sea level rise, although we're seeing that becoming increasingly a challenge if sea level rise continue to rise at such a rapid rate that we're seeing now. But there's other co-benefits here, like stabilizing the shoreline and helping to prevent erosion. These sort of living shorelines and wetlands can also serve as carbon sinks, meaning they can help to store some CO2 actually in their roots. So, almost sucking the carbon straight out of the air and storing them in the roots. And so, are these going to really reduce our emissions on a massive scale? I mean, probably not, but we should look at all of these things as sort of tools in a large toolbox. We kind of need all of them when we think about what the solutions are for New York City and for Queens more specifically. So, no single solution means that we're going to need green solutions. We're going to need gray solutions. We're going to need, retrofits for homeowners. We'll need to support residents who are looking for buyouts, elevating critical infrastructure. There's not really going to be a single solution that's going to protect the entire city, the entire borough. It's going to take a suite of solutions. So that's sort of a preface to the statement. And I think, to your question about if there was a way to streamline anything, it's also tough. And there's so many things that you could really think about doing. But I think what would be really, really important and what I would love to see is sort of a comprehensive resilience strategy when it comes to tackling climate change. And comprehensive, I mean something at the city or the state level where we're doing things like offering funding for technical capacity that supports communities and neighborhoods in their planning for future climate change. In the map that Rob showed and that RPA has been working on, you can sort of see where some community visioning and engagement and planning efforts have gone by. But it would be really great if we could have that happen on a much larger scale with support from the city. And so you can sort of start maybe thinking about how those projects come to life. And, it would be great to see a citywide climate change adaptation and resiliency plan that really centers community engagement and environmental justice and equity. Something that I hear, I think far too often when we're working in Queens is where's the sort of Big U project for Queens? And for those who might not be familiar, the Big U is this kind of massive infrastructure project that's on the lower U part of Manhattan. It's focused on the threats of climate change. And it's really great because we know that the Lower East Side and the Battery and these places are really at risk, but we also really saw how badly southern Queens was hit by Sandy, and central and northern Queens are flooding from various rain events. And so where's the sort of big project for those communities? And what I really like to see, I think, is an opportunity for New York City to pull together a better understanding of what places are most at risk of climate change, not just what places are most at risk with the most economic value, but most at risk with the highest concentration of environmental justice concerns. And how can we start looking at protecting those places, and what do communities and residents in those neighborhoods want to see for their future? And then how can we really start thinking about bringing those things to life?
Tyler, thank you so much. Dana, I'd love for you to weigh in here on how we're communicating risks. You've worked on climate, environmental justice, and resiliency issues within the public sector, and you recently moved over to the private sector. And I know that you can't speak for the entire public or private sectors, but is there a difference you've seen between how these sectors are discussing the environment?
Sure, and thank you for having me today. So my work has really been focused on risk awareness, as you said, and communication, and increasing understanding to where people feel that they know what to do and can take action. So in some ways, from what I've seen, the public sector is ahead of the private sector in understanding risk from the impacts of climate change and the need for resilience action and adaptation, which makes sense because of increasing disasters, and the government is the one really who responds to those and who people look to for that. And I think, as Tyler was saying, resilience is a shared responsibility across all sectors. It's a new way of working, and there's a lot of change that is needed for that. And so in government, this meant bringing agencies together that historically may not have worked together, and having new collaborations to take on some of these challenges and to have some of these conversations. And this really resulted in a lot of exciting new partnerships between different agencies across the government, but also outside with academic partners. And there's a flood sensor network that's going up across the city. That's a result of one of those partnerships. But for the private sector, and I just want to say this is different if you're talking about small businesses or bigger corporations, but businesses have always had to plan for risk and disruption. They use insurance. But as for discussions about the environment and resilience and climate change, we're observing perhaps maybe 3 camps. There are those companies that have really taken on sustainability and are responding to a demand from consumers or a developing market, and they're looking to advance their business. And then there are companies that are built around a sustainable platform from the inside out, or a service. And those are really kind of those purpose-driven or impact-driven businesses. But I think the bigger question, and the one that we're really discussing today for the private sector, is what is their role in solving these societal challenges? Because climate change exacerbates the inequities that are already existing. And so where are the opportunities for businesses in not only thinking about their own risk and reducing that risk, but really supporting their employees to build resilience for their employees and with their employees, so that they can keep coming to work and feeling secure in their own lives. And then the communities in which these businesses operate or have a footprint, how can they reach outside and cross-sector? How can they build those public-private partnerships to really help support communities in facing these challenges and building resilience as well?
Thank you. And as we think about how communities are receiving information and what's being delivered is what residents actually need, Lori, I would love to ask, what is the most frequent environmental issue that gets brought to counselors at Neighborhood Housing Services of Jamaica? You're on mute, Lori.
Sorry about that. I was saying, thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here to be able to share, some of what we see in Southeastern Queens. And I would say the issue that is most often brought to us by homeowners is around flooding. As Tyler had mentioned, it's no longer just the effects of a nor'easter or the after effects of a storm that hit somewhere south. What we are now referring to as just regular rain events tend to be much more than what we used to see in the past. Homeowners come to us and say, all of a sudden, my tiles tiles blew off my roof. Now I have a leak. They have issues with windows. So now they're dealing with structural damage to their walls, to the roofs, and flooding, basement flooding, flooding of first floors is also a really big issue. There are certain neighborhoods, Springfield Gardens, Rosedale, Laurelton, and Brookville, where for decades the homeowners have been dealing with flooding basements. It's not unusual for someone to come home to 3 feet of water in their basement. And that's a real issue. And what that then leads to for many of our homeowners is basements that have been finished now have to be ripped out. They're dealing with mold issues, health concerns for family members. So it's definitely water. It's water, and as I said, it's from the rain. We see that as you said, you see the water bubbling up out of the storm sewers. Folks are just trying to deal with this, and it's a real big issue in Southeastern Queens.
Thank you so much, Lori. And on that, I know that after Ida, city agencies vowed to post more signage about flood-prone streets and include clearer flood guidance in their communications so that homeowners were better prepared for the next extreme weather event. Lori, what other measures do you think would help prepare homeowners?
I think what we have to do is we have to really reach out to the homeowners, because you read about neighborhoods that are affected in the papers, and if it doesn't happen to you, you don't really think much about it. Or if it does happen to you, you deal with it, your neighbors see it. But our homeowners really need to understand that it's key that they be prepared. And the best way, I think, to do that is, to just bombard them with information. Organizations like NHS of Jamaica can do workshops. We can bring in experts, to talk about, whether or not you need flood insurance, how to determine what kind of insurance you need. There are, contractors that could be brought in to, explain to people, this is what you need to do. These are the risks, to your particular property. And, what we always, try to sell to folks is prevention, is much better than the cure.
Yeah, absolutely. And this question is really for anyone, along the same lines. How do we increase public education and communication about increased flooding in the climate impacts affecting New York City and New Yorkers?
Happy to. Oh, yeah. Sorry, Rob, if you want to go ahead. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here, and I think Lori really hit the nail on the head. It's making sure that we are engaging with communities and really helping folks understand sort of what their risks are going to look like, not just now, but down the line. And one piece that I think is really important here that doesn't exist right now in New York is something called flood risk disclosure. So this is something that Waterfront Alliance has been working on, and with collaboration with our Rise to Resilience Coalition, which some of the panelists here are a member of that coalition and have been supportive of these sort of efforts. But for those who might not know, right now in New York State, if you were to purchase a property, the seller would not have to disclose any past flood damages, or whether the property is required to maintain flood insurance under the mortgage, whether you're in a floodplain, or really anything, any information informing you on what your risks might be. And that's, I think, really problematic when it comes to making what's probably the biggest investment that somebody makes in their lifetime, which is buying a home. In New York State right now, there is a $500, fee, but we really call it a loophole because the seller can just pay $500 to the buyer, credit on the property to the buyer at the time of closing, and avoid having to disclose any of that information. And so that really it feels almost scammy, right? I mean, it's not even so much a climate protection or a climate topic. It almost feels more like a consumer protection issue that you should be going in and making the most informed decision for yourself. And so one thing that we're really working on is trying to introduce legislation at the state level that would mandate buyers to have to, or sellers, excuse me, to have to disclose all this information to buyers. This is a best practice that's seen across the country. After Hurricane Harvey, Texas passed flood disclosure for renters and for buyers, and now they have the strongest legislation in the country. And it's not often that I think you say Texas has a stronger sort of climate bill than New York, but that actually is the case. There was a study done by NRDC and the Columbia University Center for Climate Change Law that ranked New York's flood disclosure requirements at an F. And so, we really hope to see this legislation pass because I think lack of disclosure puts potential homeowners and renters at risk of unknowingly buying a flood-prone home. You might have once thought that if you just live by the water, you'd probably have some risk for flooding. But what we're seeing in central and northern and inland parts of Queens is that, and really all of New York City, is that you don't have to be by the waterfront to experience regular flooding anymore. And so I think, flood disclosure can be a really strong way of communicating that risk to people when they're moving into their property. And that could ultimately lead to an increase in flood insurance or help you make a better informed decision on where you're going to live and the cost that you might incur.
Jennifer, I'd like to add that while, it's not a requirement that, the risk of flooding be disclosed to home buyers, we advise all of our, pre-purchase clients to make certain that they get, a home inspection. There's nothing that says until such legislation is passed, we could educate people by saying, these are the questions that you need to ask. You may surprise a homeowner who doesn't expect, to get that question, and they'll answer honestly. But if not, they can go the extra mile. It's going to cost something, but they can have someone do the research for them, to find out, has there been flooding in this area, that type of thing.
Yeah, I just want to jump in on this point as well, because I think it's all these things are really important, and I think the city has a role, as you pointed out, Jennifer, in this as well. And I know the current administration recently put out a report that kind of put what their responsibility is in this space and what kind of residents' responsibility is in this space, and they even offered a program that's been I guess I would say, featured in the media of kind of handing out inflatable dams for people's homes. So I think there's something to be said for what the city can do, but I also want to spotlight the importance of just the kind of community itself and community resilience. And I think this kind of plays out, we've heard a lot about it in the past in terms of extreme heat. And that's kind of neighbors checking in on each other. If you have the kind of community that encourages neighborliness, I think there's something to be said for that as well. Kind of people sharing their experiences, and that comes down to the kind of neighborhoods that we design as well. And are we creating public spaces where people can gather? And there's a layer deeper than just kind of making people aware of floods. There's kind of creating communities that we want to have where people are a true community, and there's a neighborhood kind of function to people checking in on each other and sharing information, talking about the floods, talking about their homes. And I wouldn't want to miss that as an opportunity too, to kind of ensure that we're creating the kind of social resilience in our neighborhoods that get at this too, because there's a lot of layers to this.
I'll add to this conversation as well. I think in addition to all the great points that have been made, I think attaching this kind of information to other information that that residents and everybody kind of looks for and affects different parts of your life. So it's not we are only talking about this one topic at this one time, but things like flood insurance or, flood risk could be included in financial counseling, or there are partnerships where that information has been added to certain real estate listings, and there's education programs for real estate brokers to start sharing that information, or at least know where to point people to get that information. We have interactions throughout our days, and finding out kind of where people are and finding out what's a priority in community members' minds, and then attaching this kind of really critical information to that is another way of just integrating it into a mindset, so that it is top of mind, and people do have the information that they have to know what to do when an event does happen.
All important points. Thank you so much. To just shift gears here, Dana, you had touched on flood insurance. And we know New York is one of the top 10 states that lost active national flood insurance policies within the last year, attributed mostly to increased premium costs. This question is for anyone. What can be done to lower flood insurance premiums to ensure that those who need it most can afford it? And a question, if that's not possible, would be, how else could we close the affordability gap here?
Now, look, I think you're touching on a really good topic and necessary topic, because we do have a lot of people who live in the floodplain, and flood insurance is necessary. I think we want to move to a future where we have less people in the floodplain, but there's a long way to go between kind of where we are now to where we kind of need to be, and what we need to do to make sure people are protected either in the floodplain or out. So, I think this question of flood insurance has been one that's been, tossed around for a number of years now. And every time it kind of gets to a point where it seems like it's going to be enacted, things change and politics change, and it's really hard. I don't know that any of us would have any answer here, but to say that it's really challenging and needs to be figured out. And I think the thing that needs to be figured out is how to ensure that people who really need it but can't afford it can have that, as we figure out other solutions to kind of protect people or find other places outside the floodplain for people to live.
Thanks, Rob. Curious, Lori, to address climate change and other major challenges, as we think about the tools or strategies for mobilizing homeowners, what would you recommend?
I think folks often, our sense of community seems to be very different, than it was, say, 40, 50 years ago. Not sure how, we address that, but I think we need to rely on, our local elected officials. We need to rely on community leaders, whether it be, a religious leader or, or someone of, the block association. We need to get people, to a place where they understand that they have to come together and they have to speak with one voice. I think of the 20 or so folks, in Hollis, they protested and they've asked for certain things. They talked about buyouts, but as I think Tyler had mentioned, often it's not the folks who are even in the floodplain, who are most affected by this. And so people need to understand they are at risk. In order to be heard, they have to come together, and we really do have to rely on groups like Neighborhood Housing Services and other nonprofit agencies that are working with the community. And as I said, our elected officials and other community leaders to come together and organize folks to to make their needs known.
So important. You also touched on the increased flooding being a reality for all New Yorkers, not just coastal communities. I'd love to hear from all of you on what adaptation strategies are being implemented to protect homes, residents, and businesses from destructive floods.
I mean, I'll give a plug to the city's emerging cloudburst program, which I think is a really interesting approach, which kind of looks at a system, which kind of speaks to what we were trying to do with our right-of-way report, and says if you follow, say, a drop of water from extreme rain and kind of see all the places it goes, how do you incorporate that entire system into being part of the solution? And that's, it follows an approach from, I believe, Denmark, where they follow a cloudburst solution, and they really look at ways you can move water to places that can handle the water, absorb the water, or store the water. The example that they have now is in Jamaica houses, where they're retrofitting a basketball court, I believe on a public housing property, NYCHA, I think, and they're basically sinking the basketball court so it becomes a storage tank for water, and then the water that they're directing the water to that basketball court. So during the day, it's a basketball court. During the sunny days, it's a basketball court that everybody can use. During a storm, it becomes a place to hold the water until it can kind of get in, not flood neighborhoods, but hold it in the basketball court. And I think approaches like that take it to the entire system and look at it almost as a little mini watershed is going to be one of the ways that we kind of manage flooding, but it will require kind of a repurposing of our public space in some ways. Parks may become dual purpose parks, where they're a park and a place we gather, but also a place to store water, and that will require retrofits and adaptations. So we're going to have to change the way we do things, but we can maintain the use of things and then add another use to it. And I think that's a really promising opportunity that the city's pursuing.
Yeah, I think I'd like to just echo some of the points Rob made there at the end, and just say that while there have been some adaptation strategies maybe explored by the city, I mean, I think we're seeing a couple of things going on. There's Red Hook coastal resiliency, and in the east side coastal resiliency, and there's even a massive federal infrastructure project sort of coming down the pipeline, the New York, New Jersey Harbor and Tributary Study, which is a project led by the Army Corps of Engineers that was sort of started after the impacts of Sandy. There's a lot of work that's sort of starting to be done, but I don't know that there's really enough. And so, there's definitely a way that I think climate resilience and adaptation offers an opportunity to think really creatively and innovatively about the sort of future that we want to have. I think there's going to be changes, to Rob's point, and it offers us an opportunity to sort of look at some of the things that maybe were done wrong in the past by a city agency or a federal agency, whether it's a highway or something, and think about how can we adapt and use those and rewrite some of those wrongs that have been historically done and build towards a sort of climate friendly future.
Thanks so much, Tyler and Rob. Dana, who if you haven't already touched on this earlier, who would you like to see you collaborate on these issues?
Well, from what Rob and was talking about, that would be there's private builders and and development that could be collaborating with private and public together to build that way. I think there's a lot of opportunity for there's a lot of opportunity for tech to be collaborating on these issues, because having platforms where people can be understanding different data sources and really educating themselves. There's opportunity for, tech and insurance companies to be making insurance an easier product to use for people, which, then kind of helps people prepare and understand what they need. So there's a lot of opportunity out there between private and public to work together. And there's opportunity for creativity, as everybody said, as far as, the risk communication and making sure that, the information that we've all been talking about, these maps are accessible for people, and that people really understand the risk in a language that they all, they use, that's not very technical. I think there's a lot of opportunity for that kind of collaboration as well.
Thanks, Dana. Rob, this question's for you. You put out a statement applauding the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act earlier this year. What policy will be the most beneficial for homeowners or low and moderate income neighborhoods?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's a lot in there that is going to be helpful to homeowners, but I think it's maybe even a step back of how does that act fundamentally change the way that we change the path that we're on now, because I think the path we're on right now is not very good, and I think what that act does is it starts to shift how we produce things, what we produce, to kind of make a more climate friendly future. So I guess it's, to some degree, it's a few steps removed from the bill, but if we move towards a greener future and directly, folks are going to be able to invest in better, say, infrastructure in their homes for heat pumps and those kinds of things where people don't have to be reliant on kind of natural gas and the ways that we kind of heat our homes now. So there's that directly, but I think the big shift with this is that we're pushing the manufacturing of what we manufacture in this country towards a more climate friendly way that's going to benefit everyone. So I'd say from the individual home of kind of being able to upgrade your home to be more climate friendly, to the fact that we're putting this country on a path to lower emissions and minimizing the degree of threat that climate change poses to homeowners. There's a lot in there to kind of get us going in that direction.
I'm not sure if anyone else wants to respond to that. My next question would be for Tyler with regard to policy. You've stated that the time for administrative excellence in the face of great challenges is now. What would administrative excellence look like in Queens?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I mean, I think I sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but since Sandy back in 2012, we've seen a lot of changes made in the way that we kind of govern flood resilience and adaptation. At the state level, we saw the Community Risk and Resiliency Act that sort of committed the state to incorporating sea level rise into their agency management, but without, I think, any structural change. And then in New York City, there was a new Mayor's Office of Resiliency developed, which is now the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, that would help kind of lead resiliency projects. And so I think even despite sort of all that, action that addresses future storm surge and stormwater, urban flooding, sea level rise, it remains a little bit fragmented. And so there's some specific challenges that I think that brings, which is, potentially lack of coordination and planning and decision making across some of the agencies and levels of government. And, I just hope that, unfortunately, that, it would be unfortunate. I mean, that if this kind of led to an inconsistent and inefficient approach to reducing our risk. And then I'd also say that sort of funding streams for capital projects and planning has also been a little bit inconsistent for climate risk and social vulnerability. And so, that could ultimately result in more exposure to risk and lost opportunities to sort of address some of the solutions and gaps that we see. And so to me, I think administrative excellence would look like really clear leadership with a shared strategic goals across all the agencies, maybe establishing, clear authority and resources that would develop and update a comprehensive climate resiliency plan that I mentioned earlier, leading climate resilience mitigation policies, coordinating work groups, maybe interagency work groups that would help build sort of consistent policy implementation across the agencies. And again, instead of that sort of siloed effect that maybe we're working in right now, and then just making sure that we're communicating progress towards the public. I think we're still sort of new into this this administration, and so it's a little bit of a holding pattern. But I think there's definitely going to be a lot of work ahead of us in terms of making sure that agencies are up to staff, whether it's engineers or policy people, and just making sure that we are taking climate change very seriously at a comprehensive, strategic, sort of system-wide level at the city level.
Thanks so much. Any other wish list steps to add to this list here that we've been growing in this panel?
I think, just building on Tyler's comments, like excellence in government is also the ability to listen to the people that are being governed, right? And I think I don't think we've figured that out yet. I think that we've got community engagement down to kind of practices that reach people. But, I think if we take a lesson from the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, where community was engaged and the project completely changed on them, we don't want to do that again. And I think as we adapt our communities, we really need to be listening to communities. And I think the city can find a way, and I think will find a way to truly hear communities and understand what their needs are and incorporate those into the plans. And it's almost like a joint effort in planning together. And I think that's going to be completely necessary to kind of take us into this future we're talking about.
Rob, thank you. Thank you for landing us there. Rob, Lori, Dana, Tyler, thank you so much. Just a great opportunity to speak on this issue, and looking forward to making these wish lists come true. Thank you all for your time today, and we'll see you in the next panel.
Hello again, all. Thank you for literally putting a spotlight on Queens and the borough-specific challenges. It's amazing to hear what's being done presently to support Queens residents and explore what the future holds. Now it's time to head back to the main agenda page and click on the link for last but never least panel of the day, expanding credit. Take a quick break, stretch, grab a snack. Afterwards, head back to the main agenda page. Click to join the session at 2:30 p.m. and I will see you there.